From Houston, I am Laura Freudenberger,
And I'm Esther Levine.
and we are the co-chairs for tonight's Community Read event, a shared literary experience for book clubs and individual readers. We are so glad you could tune in, and we are really excited to have our community join us tonight in this virtual world, and we have close to 200 households out there participating tonight. We welcome you as we celebrate our 48-year tradition of connecting community through authors, theater, and film during our virtual Ann and Stephen Kaufman Jewish Book and Arts Festival, presented by the Evelyn Rubinstein JCC here in Houston. Our month-long celebration of offerings is available for you to enjoy wherever you are. Visit erjcchouston.org to get your ticket or subscription and watch the programs on our J at Home platform, either live or on demand from the comfort of your own home.
Tonight, we are so pleased to feature Esther Amini, author of Concealed, Memoir of a Jewish Iranian Daughter Caught Between the Shador and America, in conversation with Angela Himsel, author of A River Could Be a Tree.
This festival is underwritten by the Eleanor and Frank Fried Foundation and by our many JCC patrons of the arts who support fuels this festival and the entire Arts and Ideas season here at the J. Tonight's program is supported by the Rosita and Albert Gaon Sephardic Heritage Program Endowment Fund. Thank you to our Houston book clubs and our readers for participating in this community read program.
As we searched for our community read selection, we were looking for a book that would help us learn something new and focus on a topic with which we might not be familiar. We wanted our choice to be exceptionally well written and tell a unique and engaging story. Esther Amini's memoir has done just that. Esther Amini is a writer, a painter, and psychoanalytic psychotherapist in private practice. Esther's debut book is a beautifully crafted memoir about growing up in the 1960s as the daughter of parents who fled Mashhad, Iran's holiest Muslim city. It is a deeply personal tale filled with painful honesty and laugh-out-loud humor. It brilliantly tells the story of a beautiful as well as dutiful daughter caught between two worlds, one in which she is expected to honor her family's restrictive traditions, and the other in which she is driven to become educated and independent.
We are also thrilled to have Angela Himsel, the author of A River Could Be a Tree, to moderate our conversation with Esther. Angela's book is about growing up in rural southern Indiana in a large evangelical Christian home. Angela, searching for salvation at the age of 19, decided to go study at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. This education set her on a different path where she ultimately found her own form of salvation as a practicing Jewish woman.
At the end of the presentation, Esther Amini will take your questions. Please use the Q&A feature, which you will find at the bottom of your screen, to type your question. We will try to get to as many audience questions as possible.
And a few times tonight, you'll see a link to purchase the book in the chat box. We hope you will consider purchasing the book through our bookstore partners, Brazos Bookstore or Blue Willow Bookshop, if you haven't done so already.
Also, this program is being recorded and will be available on the J at Home platform if there are friends who couldn't make it this evening. Thank you for spending your evening with us, and please join us in welcoming Esther and Angela.
Hi, Esther. Sorry, didn't see you over there. Esther, I loved your book, Concealed, and I grew up obviously very different than you grew up. Your family is from Mashhad, as they mentioned before, in Iran. And your mother was 14 and your father was 34 when they got married. They were underground Jews, and so when your mother was outside, she had to wear the chador. These are the people you're from. We have a photo of your grandparents, Tuti, who was 9 years old when she married your grandfather, who was 29 years old. And your great-grandfather was a very successful merchant in Iran. but your mother was not happy with the way things were in Iran, and she decided that they were going to leave and they were going to go to America and look for a better world. Good for her. So they went to the tomb of Esther to pray, and sure enough, their prayers were answered. You were born in the United States of America in Queens. Um, and you know, your book is really about so many things. It's about family and it's about love. It's about so many things, but it's also about trying to bridge those two worlds, the world that they left behind and the world that they found. And there's a scene in your memoir that I just loved. And it was when your mother had you dress up as a Bukharian shepherd for Purim. And there you are with your staff and everything. And you just wanted to be the cook or the nurse or something. But guess what? You won first prize. So there. I love that scene. You ended up managing to go to Barnard College, all difficulties aside. And I guess that one of the people who I was so taken with in the book, I was taken with everybody, but you and your mother, I mean, she also defied the odds and came here and had this inner strength, somebody who was uneducated and who had so many hardships in her life. So shout out to mom. Um, so I was reading this and I realized, you know, I totally identified with you, even though I obviously did not exactly grow up like you, and I don't think anybody did. So when you were writing it, did you have in mind the audience that you really thought was going to like it? Did you think this was like a narrow audience, or did you think it had a more universal quality?
I did not expect to receive the reception that I've received. I thought it would be very, very narrow because it's about the Jews of Mashhad, often called the Moranos, compared to the Moranos of Spain, a very specific community that lived underground, pretending they were Muslim, and yet in the privacy of their homes, they were devout Jews. And so here we have them coming to the United States, right, my family coming to the United States right after World War II. They left in 1946. It was a arduous journey. It took about a year or more to finally arrive, and they came in 1947. They arrived in 1947. So it's a very specific story. And then later I'm born, and the impact, the baggage that they brought with them metaphorically, the values, the Islamic world that they brought with them unbeknownst to them, and the impact it had on me, and how I navigated the two worlds, America and Iran, living in Queens, New York. So I thought this was very specific, very particular, and I didn't know how it would be accepted. And I'm still in a state of shock because I get emails from around the world, people who are not Jewish, not Persian, and saying, I relate. And I say, like, relate? I thought no one had my mother, no one had my father, no one had that specific background. And yet the book has universal appeal. So I have to stop and say to myself, what are the bare bones? What's the skeletal structure? Why is it speaking to thousands and thousands of people? And what I come away with is that within America, it's an American story. It's an immigrant story. We're all children of immigrants. If we may not be first generation American, but we do come from another culture. We come from another land. There's something about that I think speaks to Americans across the board. There's the whole theme of growing up and finding yourself, not being quite like your mother or like your father, not wanting to lose them, not wanting to in any way create a rupture, and at the same time wanting to grow and find out who you are and become your own person. How do you do that? I think that's a universal theme. I think making mistakes. I made lots of mistakes growing up, and I felt I was learning from these mistakes. and how the mistakes then changed my path, and I had to take a different direction, and how I strengthened myself as a result of making mistakes. I mean, that's universal. I think the mother-daughter relationship is loaded for many people, regardless of how wonderful your mother may be. That feeling of wanting to differentiate yourself from your mother is universal. I have a sibling piece in here, and my brothers were phenomenal. Those who have siblings can relate perhaps to part of this or not to any of it, but it makes them think about their own sibling relationship. There's a lot that I realize goes way beyond the Mashhedi world, because it's really receiving such an incredible reception. And I'd like you to tell me why, Angela. maybe I haven't covered it all.
I think, honestly, yeah, you know, look, I would agree with all of your sentiments right there. And I also would say that there's another thing that you did not mention, and that's the honesty, because I do think that people, readers in general, we really respond to honesty. And if somebody is really being honest, it's a memoir, so you're supposed to kind of try to be honest as best one can. And that actually was my next question, which was, how hard was that level of honesty? Were you afraid of what your family would think, the Mashhad community would think? I mean, how difficult was that to write?
Well, you're a writer, and you wrote a memoir. So you know that if you're going to write it authentically, and you're going to go back to your early childhood and feel it and viscerally and put it on paper and travel all the way up to who you are today, you cannot be thinking about others. You cannot, because the minute you start thinking about what will this person think, what will that person feel, you are corking yourself up. You're handcuffing yourself and corking. So in order to let it flow and let it come out as it truly was, that's very important, not to think about outside critics, outside feelings. And my intent is not to hurt anyone. My intent is to really share what happened, and with every stage, you know, I was trying very hard to write it when I am a toddler, when I am a pre-adolescent, through that lens of what I was feeling. And a lot of it was misinterpreting what was going on because I'm a child. And then later on as an adolescent, how I was perceiving very similar situations, different stories, different episodes, but the theme was the same, and how I was perceiving it. And that was different, and my lens kept changing. And later it was as a college student, how I saw my interior life and my exterior life. It changed. Went right through until I became a professional. And then later I married and I had children and I became a mother, and my perception changed. And so I think all of that was very necessary. Hopefully we all evolve, and hopefully our interpretation of our past changes, because cognitively we are more intelligent, wiser, more experienced, where there's more breadth of thought. We can actually consider other people and what they went through and factor that in. So it all changes. And in order to allow myself to go through that journey, I had to shut out the outside world.
You did a great job. I have to say that was one of the things I loved also, was that there was a very strong sense that when you were a child, you were a child, and you're not projecting backward as an adult as to what you thought you should have felt or would have felt or would rather have felt. And by the way, I do think, sorry to sound crass, but it's useful that our parents are dead when we publish these memoirs. You know, I don't know that I personally would have been as comfortable if my parents had been alive. Would you have been?
I think more than whether I would be comfortable or not comfortable, I think the question is really perspective, and I needed more perspective. My father passed away 24 years ago, and my mother passed away 20 years ago. And I think I needed these 20 years to distance myself from it all and to continue to grow up and to think about it differently. You know, again, I write it like I felt it back then, but it evolves. And so to allow it to evolve, I needed that distance. And I think that was very important for me.
Yeah. Well, so when you were writing it, did you, in the back of your head or even in the front of your head, think to yourself, well, I really want the reader to kind of come away with this? Or were there takeaways that you expected or hoped a reader would understand or come to simply from reading your memoir?
I didn't want to have a destination in mind. I didn't want to have a formula. I mean, I know different writers work differently. For me, I needed not to know where I was going. And I felt that the voice would be more honest and less premeditated. And so as I was writing these stories, they were interconnecting and they took me to another memory, another stage of life. And I didn't even know where I was going to land and what I was going to say at the end. So what was I going to have to say after all of this? And it just organically came out. Of course, I had to write and rewrite hundreds of times. I'm not saying that it was a straight line, but there was a lot of cutting, a lot of adding, a lot of altering as to what's important, what's not, how to keep that narrative drive going. What should I save for another book? What should I save for another story? Because it's not as pertinent to this one. So there's a lot of work that goes into it. But in terms of deciding what I want you to feel at the very end, I didn't want to think that way. I wanted to give you the freedom, you, the reader, to feel whatever you want to feel at the very end. And maybe you can tell me. And so what happened was I started getting emails, and I love getting emails from readers, and they were telling me what their takeaway was. And that was fascinating. There are readers who wrote, I think your book is all about resilience and teaching us resilience. Now, never was I thinking that word as I was writing. Never was I saying to myself, I want you to feel my resilience and I want you to be resilient. Never. But it was wonderful to hear that that's what this person gleaned. And someone else wrote that it was a dedication to my parents, and I was honoring my parents. And I said, you know, it's true. That too is true. I mean, I wasn't saying I'm writing this book to honor my parents, but that's what I was doing on some level. And someone else wrote that it represents hope. That one can be faced by all kinds of obstacles, but there is hope and there's a way around it all. And so I'm listening to this and I'm saying, I understand how you came to that. But I didn't want to have an agenda. And I think that it feels more natural and more believable when there is no agenda.
Certainly would agree with you. They say there's this quote that says that when you write a memoir, you live twice. So did anything stand out in the second time around that you were living your life all over again?
It's a wonderful quote. You do live twice. You've lived your life, then you go back and you say, now I'm going to write it, but I have to feel it. I have to go back and be that 2-3-year-old child. I have to get into her body, into her mind, whatever little mind I had back then. I have to feel every story that I can remember. And so I'm reliving it all viscerally. And yet, at the same time, there is the adult me standing next to that child. And I didn't want that adult me to have a voice until I became the adult, and then the adult has the voice. But that adult me was standing next to me as I was going through all of this and metabolizing the story and understanding that child a lot better. And later in life, thinking differently and correcting. And so it creates a cohesion. I think it brings a lot of fragments together when you live your life a second time by writing it. It has a cohesive effect. It's one thing to talk about it. It's very different to write about it. You live it differently.
Right, I would agree with that.
It's integrative, maybe that's the word. You know, I felt more integrated by the time I finished. And I think also I felt closer to my story and I felt liberated from my story. And so it had a push-pull feeling, which is also wonderful.
That's great. You know, Esther, I was flipping through your book earlier, and I remembered this passage that I loved. I didn't include it in one of my questions, so now I'm gonna put this on you. Your book is called Concealed, and certainly there's so many different things that are concealed in terms of identity, concealing yourself behind the chador. You had to conceal your books underneath the blankets because your father disapproved of them. And books is reading, and books are really a big part of it. I actually think that that's one of the things I really identified with as a writer and reader as well. But there's a scene, and I wrote it down. It's on page 147, and it's, yes, there you go. And it's on page 147, and it's about female writers. And would you mind reading a little bit of it for us?
Sure. This is a chapter that's called Protégé. Before I begin, my brother David was an avid reader, and in our family, it was okay for the boys to read. It was not okay for a girl to read. So that's why his room was filled with books. So my brother David's bedroom was lined from floor to ceiling with books. American, British, Russian, German, French, Scandinavian, Spanish, and South American novelists, playwrights, and poets. Western European writers dominated, with no hint or trace of his Iranian heritage. Nosing through his collection, I came across female authors who broke down barriers and gained their freedom by reading and writing. There was George Eliot, the Victorian novelist, who hid behind a male pen name to ensure her books would be taken seriously. Charlotte, Emily, and Anne Bronte, like many of their female contemporaries, first published as men, using Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell as their names. Louisa May Alcott, best known for Little Women, used the androgynous pen name A.M. Barnard on her unladylike Gothic thrillers. Circumventing gender bias, they each wore a mask in order to be seen. They each spoke through stories, through literary characters, in order to be heard. They weren't afraid. They didn't hold their tongues. I still had an uneven relationship with spoken words, but had been writing in my diary faithfully for years. Now, the power and possibility of written language became an even more invigorating thought.
I love that. Do you think about that sometimes now, even though that you wrote it and you've written about it? Have you thought about that sort of since you've been, now that you are one of those female authors and your name is on a book and you can just go forth and reveal yourself to the world? Do you think about those authors who could not?
I think about those authors who found a way to do it. I mean, you know, they disguised themselves. They changed their names, but they still made sure their voices were heard. And I think that was so inspirational for me to know that there's a way through. Now, of course, I didn't have to disguise my name. I just had to gather up the courage and say, ask myself, why am I doing this? What's my intent? Why do I need to? Is it making sense? Is it necessary? And all the answers were yes, it's absolutely necessary. It's something I have to do. I absolutely have to do. And you might say, why? Why were you so compelled? And the answer is because I come from a long, long history of women who were kept illiterate. In the city of Mashhad, women were not sent to school and they were purposefully kept illiterate with the prevailing wisdom that a woman who cannot read and write will make an excellent wife. And they were married off young, as you had mentioned earlier. My grandmother, my father's mother, was married at the age of 9 to my 29-year-old grandfather. I can't even wrap my head around that. And my mother was 14, forced to marry my 34-year-old father. So they were kept. My mother was also never schooled, and so she also could not read or write. And here I am, the first, after thousands of years, the first that somehow managed. Thank God to America that gave me the opportunity. I was born here and you're expected to go to school. So that was my first opportunity. And then going on to college and graduate school. And I said, if I don't write the story, who will? You know, I am the bridge between my children who are now second generation American and my parents who actually lived the underground life in Mashhad. So I had a very strong feeling that it was up to me, it was my responsibility to give voice to them and to give voice to myself and to just uncork, you know, take that muzzle off and allow whoever follows me, my descendants, to write and speak and think openly. And maybe I can like switch gears and change the future of my lineage by not being afraid to do it. And so I did feel compelled, and I had to fight some of my fears, and I'm glad I did, because in retrospect, there was nothing to be afraid of. And I feel that I've made a contribution.
I would certainly agree with that. You know, that reminds me of another quote. At one point you say the subconscious is the concealed voice. And I do love the way you've sprinkled that word concealed throughout, because it applies to so many different things in your book. And, you know, you're a psychotherapist, as you said, and you deal with the subconscious all the time. So I'm curious how being, how your profession affected not necessarily what you said, but how you said it. Meaning, were you more careful in terms of your language as a psychotherapist, or because what was great about it was, well, there was many things, by the way, which is it's not psychoanalytical on the surface, but somebody has thought very deeply about these issues, but it doesn't come across as a kind of just kind of spit out therapy session, let's just say. So that's an interesting balance to have when you have so much insight now, but you don't want it to come across. It's a story, and you did a great job of making it a story. But did being a psychotherapist impact or change in any way the way you told the story?
Well, as you say, I certainly didn't want to write it like an analyst. I didn't want the voice of the clinician to come through at all. I wanted to get back to that child, that teenager, that young adult, and just feel it as it was. But when it comes to peeling layers and wanting to understand my parents better, wanting to understand that culture, wanting to understand me, my friends, the Western world, Barnard, what was going on in the 1960s, you know, it was exploding. It was the sexual revolution. There I am at Barnard. And my father went on a suicidal hunger strike because I moved into Barnard. And then all that was going on, the drugs, the promiscuity, Vietnam, the demonstrations, and trying to make sense. I mean, I think I always had a curiosity and a wish to understand something more deeply, not satisfied with a surface answer. So I think that even precedes having become a psychotherapist. I think I've always felt there's more to it. People are complex. It's not so simple. I can't call one person good and another person bad. There are layers, there are reasons, there is meaning. And so that was always a part of me. So later in life, when I became a clinician and I honed the skills as to how to help someone uncover and understand whatever the issue is, the conflict, how to reach a resolution, then I developed those skills. But I think that inquisitive characteristic that would not settle for a simple answer was always within me.
Right, I'm sure it was. And by the way, the complexity of your characters was really also so gratifying to see, because nobody there is a one-dimensional or two-dimensional character. They are 3 and 4 and 5-dimensional. They have so many different layers to them, and maybe that's also something that you've just, you know, it's just so much a part of you, perhaps as your profession or just perhaps part of who you are. And I do think that's another reason it's so relatable, because in a way it gives us all permission to acknowledge our own complexity and that of our families, that so they weren't perfect, so they did this, but they were complex. And I think that that's a real gift to your readers to draw your family and your community in ways in which it's quite tender and complex, but you also don't hold, you know, any punches, and that's a tough combination, I think, to manage, to all of those balls kind of, you know, in the air. You know, we talked about reading and how important it is and has been in your life, and I know it still is. And your father was quite disapproving of it. He said that books are evil, and so you kind of had to go underground in your own way. And I thought that it was interesting that the last line of your memoir, there's no spoilers here, is there's nothing more dangerous than a girl with a book. I love that as a last line. And so I wanted to just give you maybe a few minutes, because we're going to open this up to questions in about 7 minutes, 6 minutes or so. So just kind of about books and and how your relationship with books has shaped you, and also how it's changed you today. What do you look for today in terms of books that you were not necessarily looking for back then?
Mm. Well, let me start with how books have shaped me. I think books have given me the permission to think outside of the box and to realize that you can look at the same subject matter, the same moment in time, the same item from so many different perspectives. And it has, I think it's expanded my imagination. I think it has given me permission to feel like I have opposing sides inside of myself, because I read about people who are who have many, many selves, and I feel I have many, many selves inside of me. So there's that intimacy with the other as I'm reading, and that intimacy with myself as I'm reading. I think as I commune with the author, whoever I am reading, I'm also communicating with myself and having a dialogue with myself. Like, do I agree? Do I not agree? Do I see that in myself? Is he or she saying something that I haven't recognized before in life? And so it becomes a conversation, not just with the author, but with oneself. And I find that expansive and thrilling. To introduce ideas that I don't have, whether I agree or disagree, irrelevant, just to hear others think and live to think and turn thinking into a career. Wow, there's something magnificent about that. What was part 2 of your question?
I'm not sure what my part 2 was, but I just wanted to say that I think that's another thing that was terrific about yours, was you do create this sense of intimacy. You really let people into your world in such an intimate way. And there are so many different scenes. I don't know how many people have read it, so I don't want to tell them all of the fun scenes, even though there are way too many to share. But there are so many intimate details, your relationship with your brothers, your mother, your father, and so on, your grandmother, who was sort of the sad soul. And you've created this world that we feel like we can step into, and we would recognize that kitchen, we would recognize your room, and I think that as a reader, that's a real gift that you, the author, can give to us, to let us into this world that's different than ours, but maybe not so different. So we have some questions over here, a lot. So I'm going to go to the questions, even though I have a few more of my own, which I may just slide in there. Diane Kaplan is saying, don't you think that another common thread for your story was the dominance of men over women at that time? In many families, if they could afford to send only some of the children to college, they would send the boys regardless of who was most qualified.
Yeah, but that's an American perspective.
Right.
I think it's important to understand the world they came from. And again, we can't talk about Persians as a whole, because the Jews who lived in Tehran were educating their daughters and sending them off to Swiss boarding schools. Those who were affluent, had the means, would do that. And it was considered a wonderful thing to do. Again, I'm really writing about the Jews from Mashhad. It's a whole different ball of wax. And there, because they lived in the most fanatically Islamic city in all of Iran, a city that is known for maiming and massacring infidels. And an infidel is anyone who's not Muslim. It's a city, a holy city, because there's an imam, 9th century Imam Reza, a martyr who is buried in the city of Mashhad. And so millions of people every year would come to Mashhad to pay homage to this martyr. The city is considered holy. The city has a long history of maiming and massacring infidels. You've got the Jews living underground, very, very tight, and affected and influenced by the Muslim world, which was one that believed girls should marry very young, girls should not be educated, girls should not read and write. And that infiltrated their lives. And so boys should be able to read and write. They have to make a living. They have to become merchants. They have to be able to make transactions. So it was coming out of that culture. It wasn't arbitrary. And so, yes, today in America, you say, that's terrible. Girls should have equal opportunity. I certainly wanted it, but understanding where it originated from, and this is what they thought worked. This is what worked in society. They didn't see, my parents had never seen a young girl come out of Mashhad, an observant Jewish young girl, come out of Mashhad, go to school, go to college, and eventually become a wife, have children, and live a wholesome, healthy life. They hadn't seen that result. And if you've never seen the other end of the tunnel, like what comes out, it's very hard to advocate for it. I mean, my mother didn't know what to say, and my father was against education. But I understand my mother's silence, because she was a outspoken, rebellious woman. But when it came to my education, she suddenly went silent. And as a child, I felt betrayed. I was hurt. I was so hurt. But as an adult looking back, I can understand. She didn't know what to root for because she didn't know what the results would be. And so, you know, I'm hoping that by reading the book, there's a lot of humor. There are many comedic moments. It's not doom and gloom by any means. But when you get to this, I'm hoping that you begin to empathize with the value system and the belief system that held them together, that enabled them to continue holding on to Judaism and passing tradition on to the next generation. I mean, so they felt this is the glue that works. Only you bring that glue to New York City, where I'm born, and suddenly it doesn't work.
Right. Yeah. No, very well put. I have two questions about your brothers. One from Marilyn Fireman saying, are you still very close to your brothers? And Kathy Hodell says, how do your brothers feel about the book?
Well, my brothers are very proud and supportive. And yes, I'm still close to my brothers. They were heroic figures when I was a child and even through my teens. And the feeling is still strong and warm and loving.
That's great. Another question about your brother. I was surprised to read that both your brothers left their careers and went into your father's business. Do they still work in that business today? And what do they think now about that decision?
Well, I can't speak for them. I can't say what they think or what they feel. But they're much older now. Mm-hmm. And so one is retired and the other is still in the rug business. But I mean, a lot came out of it that was good. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to say. I don't know exactly how they feel, but they seem happy.
This is such a fun question. Iris Fisherman is asking you, how did your mother know about Oscar de la Renta? She couldn't read and would have had limited access to such information. I was so fascinated by her sense of daring and her including you in her wild adventures.
Well, she loved looking at fashion magazines, and you don't have to read, you just have to look. And she was a big talker. She would speak to other women, women. There were Iranian women, there were American neighbors. She was gregarious.
Mm-hmm.
So she would learn a lot through conversation and flipping through magazines. And she loved clothing. So it didn't take much for her to figure out what is an Oscar de la Renta. She was an extractor. She extracted from her environment, and in many ways did not need to read or write, although she always felt wounded. She always felt deprived. She always felt, she used to say, I feel like there's a bullet in my brain. And she did feel shut out of life. But she was a very strong character, and so she navigated around whatever deficits she had in order to attain the information she wanted. She was a go-getter.
Mm-hmm.
So that's it.
Yeah. Susan Farb Morris is asking, are there still Jews left in your Iranian hometown of Mashhad?
As far as I know, there aren't. That question has come up before, and I've been asked, and I know someone who's doing a research project on the Jews of Mashhad, and this woman lives in Vienna, and she told me she went last year to Mashhad. Mm-hmm. And she was looking for the Jewish community, and she said there wasn't one Jew. I mean, I'm assuming she's right. And it's understandable. It's the most difficult city for a Jew to live in. Totally intolerant of anyone who's different. And your life is at stake, living in Mashhad, mm-hmm. Especially today under the present regime. So the answer that I've been told is that there are none, but I really don't know firsthand.
Mm-hmm. Shirley LeBeau would like to know, did your father really go to your college in his pajamas?
Yes. Yes, every word of that story is true.
That's great. I love that.
He went to bed in his flannel pajamas and came racing into the car and determined to see this den of iniquity that I was moving into, and determined to see me turn into what he would say is a prostitute. He believed girls who went to college became prostitutes. And yes, it was, I was so humiliated. I was so embarrassed, but he was in his pajamas.
Good for personal growth. All of those humiliating moments, good for personal growth. Stephanie is saying, your mom seems like a study in contradictions. She didn't like to be touched, but she needed her community around her and loved hosting events. Do you think she was truly liked by others, or did they view her as more of a spectacle? Did you talk to any of her friends or others for their perceptions of your mom while writing this book?
Interesting. I think both. I think there were those who really liked her. She had a wild sense of humor. She was a natural comedian. Always saw always saw what people would never want to talk about and bring it out and then make fun of it. She was also very quick, and she entertained people. So she liked to imitate. She would imitate characters to the T perfectly. So there were those who were entertained by her and thought of her a little bit as a spectacle. I think that's very true. And then there were others who really liked her and had a feeling for her. They could feel her heart. They could feel her soul. They could feel her sadness, even though she didn't display it often. Publicly, she was, a happy-go-lucky woman who projected strength and autonomy and irreverence for authority. Mm-hmm. Privately, she cried a lot, and she was very, very sad. But there are people who were able to pick up on that vulnerable side in her and felt very compassionate. So there were all kinds of reactions to her.
Were you able to, the other part was, were you able to speak to any of your parents' friends when you were writing this book, or no?
Actually, I did speak to some of their peers because I was very interested in what happened in Mashhad when my mother first married my father. And she would tell me, my mother was outspoken, she would tell me, you know, when I first married your father, I hated the fact that I had to marry him and I didn't want him. I didn't know him. They were total strangers. And she said she used to run away a lot. And I was trying to envision this. And she said, you know, I would just grab a bag and run and go away for days and then come back again. And I wanted him to experience distress. I mean, she had nowhere to go. And she really, in that world, you don't file for divorce. I mean, divorce was not an option. So you had to stay married. And so she wanted to like scare him and maybe reform him in some way. If she disappears, maybe he'll become a better husband to her. I wanted to hear more about that. I didn't know how much of it she was exaggerating. Was it real? So I spoke to some of her peers who live in New York and lived in Mashhad at the same time. And I heard that, yes, she did a lot of running away and she went into some of their homes and she'd stay there overnight and then go back to my father and rant and rave about not wanting to be married off this way and sad that she was 14, forced to marry a 34-year-old man. And then she was 15 when she was pregnant with my brother. So she was a child bride, and a teenage mother. And she did more running away after she gave birth. Well, that running away continued. So I did check it out. That was something I really wanted to hear firsthand. They were a total mismatch. They were never right for one another. They each had their strengths, and but they didn't complement one another at all.
Right. Well, two people have asked here about your children. How have they received this book? And I think that was the question. How have they received this book?
They were overjoyed. You know, I kept the book from them. I told them I'm writing, of course, and I told them what I'm writing about. But they kept saying, as you're writing, can we read? Can we give us a draft? Let's see what you're saying. And I'd say, no, sorry, I'm going to wait until it's totally finished because I know that you don't have, I don't think you have the ability to read it once as a rough draft and then read it again when it's finished. And so I really want to make sure you give it your attention. And so I waited until it was actually published and it was a hard copy, and I each gave them a hard copy. And the minute I gave it to them, they each read it from beginning to end and raced over, came back here to my home and couldn't get over it. I mean, they felt it was such a gift to them. They felt they had heard some of these stories, not all of them, and they wanted their children, they each have children, and they wanted their children to know where they partly came from. And for their grandchildren, who I will never know, where they partly came from. And so they felt it was really important for them that I leave this story behind and also model that it's okay. It's okay to do what perhaps society is telling you you mustn't do. And in my case, society was not America. Society was Mashhad. And Mashhad was very much in my head. Even though I wasn't born there, I didn't live there, but the voice of Mashhad was in my head saying, you dare not do this. You have no right to speak, to tell your story. And I felt like there was a censorship going on constantly, which I had to battle. And so when it comes to the children, I think that they realized that I was battling a past. And I think for them, it proved to them that they can also do what feels forbidden and be who they need to be. So on many levels, it was very, very meaningful for them.
That's great. Esther, we have so many questions over here, but we have 3 minutes. So I'm going to go to the very last question, and it is from Sandra Finkelman, and it's, what's next for you?
Well, I feel like I just gave birth.
Right.
Right? And I'm in the delivery room, and they pull the baby out, and I'm looking at this baby, and a visitor comes and says, "So are you going to have more children?" So I'm still bonding with this offspring.
Right.
And I'm nurturing it. I am sending it into the world. I'm so involved in that until it really has wings of its own and it doesn't need me anymore, I'm going to be bound to this book. But would I like to write some more? Absolutely. And I hope to do, I'm thinking about perhaps some short stories, a series of short stories. There's a lot that ended up on the cutting floor because I had to keep this moving, this book, this story. And there's a lot that I feel can still be written about. So I hope to do so.
That's great. Esther, I have to tell you, I do believe that your memoir is so relatable, so universal. It definitely is about resilience. It's about mother-daughter. It's about learning to reveal yourself to yourself and to one another. Self-revelation is obviously a big part of it as well. I feel like whatever you end up writing next is going to be just terrific. And also you have your art and you have a new grandchild. So you have a lot keeping you busy these days. But thanks for talking to us. I think everybody enjoyed it. There were all of these questions here about, have you been to Mashhad and what kind of books do you like, and all of that kind of stuff. So I'm sure that if anybody wanted to contact you, they could reach you through your website. Is that right?
Absolutely. It's EstherAmini.com, EstherAmini, one word.com. And if you go there, there's a tab to contact me, and you can contact me that way.
Right. And I'm just going to make one shameless plug, and that is that if you read Esther's book and you liked it, hopefully you did, I'm sure you did, then review it on Amazon or review it on Goodreads or wherever you feel like it. I am the worst person to do this for other authors, but it's a really nice thing to do for an author if you like their book. Thank you all. It was really a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you so much. I hope you do give it 5 stars on Amazon, because the more 5 stars it gets, the more Amazon will promote the book to the outside world. So that would be quite a gift that you would be giving to the book. So thank you. But I want to thank you, Angela, because it's been an honor and a privilege to be interviewed by you. And I thoroughly enjoyed our time together.
Pleasure was really all mine. Thank you, Esther.
Esther and Angela, thank you so much. Esther, thank you for sharing Concealed with us. And Angela, thank you so much for moderating this conversation. And thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And just as a reminder, if you've missed any of our other book festival events, you can see them all. You can find them all at J at Home. Thank you so much and have a good night.